basically has lost that history to modern perception. But now, once we understand, yeah, you know what? The uniformitarians were wrong to reject all ideas of catastrophism. You know, in the early days of geology, the founding fathers of geology were catastrophists. They went out in the field unencumbered by dogmas and doctrines and so forth. They looked at the evidence in the field and concluded that there had been catastrophic. And this is, Baron von Cuvier, Sedgwick, Murchison. You go back and all of these guys are basically considered the godfathers of modern geology. They were to a man. James Hutton, Lyell, and Playfair came along and basically proposed the presence of very powerful working idea is just to look at stuff that's going on today, extrapolate backwards, and try to figure out things that happen. We don't have an eyewitness account, right? Very powerful, but what happened is it became that anybody who invoked catastrophe was considered basically free. Because in the early days, some of these guys, the traveling minister, went around in his travels to convert the people to Christianity. He would see this stuff, and he would place it within the context perhaps of the Noah's flood, right? And they would place it in, some of them, not all of them, some of them would place it in a biblical context. So when they were attacked, basically the substance of the attack was that you guys are trying to bring us back to the days of biblical liberalism in science's movement. We're not here, we don't want to talk about catastrophes or floods, deluges, we're talking about it. That's all been discredited. And what you see is between the early 1800s, with the beginning of geology, for example, to about the 19th century, what you see is a steady decline. You know, some of the older guys die off and replaced by the new guys who are now basically taking control of the university curriculum, and they're indoctrinated into this idea of strict gradualism, and that any deviation from the strict gradualism is heresy. So by the time we get to the 20th century, we have this reigning uniformity, reigning gradualist knowledge that has been imposed upon all of us. And anybody who deviates from it is immediately kicked out of the world. And this is why when J. Harlan Brett in the 19th century goes to flood the Pacific Northwest, the geological community basically said, get out of here. We know that couldn't happen. J. Harlan Brett continued to document, the document from the floods. His critics said, well, we can't provide the sources, therefore they do. Now bear in mind, all of his critics, his vocal critics, had never even gone out to Texas, right? And great section most of his critics died off. You know, he outlived. He lived to be, I think, 98. So I think when he was 96, he was given the Penrose Medal, which is the highest honor of geology. And he said he was very grateful, but the only thing he was unhappy about was the fact that all of his critics had died off, so he didn't get to gloat over them. So what happened was you had the younger geologists come in who are more open to that. And what you see is between the 1950s and 1960s, you have a transition going on where they're beginning to accept that these great floods had happened. But what they did was they took a modern example, which is glacial outburst floods, which we've witnessed dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of such cases in Iceland, particularly Alaska, British Columbia, the Himalayas, where you have, particularly going back to the Little Ice Age, when the glaciers began to recede in the mid-19th century, you had a lot of what are called proglacial lakes, or bodies of water held in by the melting ice. And then eventually the ice gave way, and the water rushed out in the form of a flood. The Icelanders call it a Jökulhlaups. Okay, so we have a modern example. So what they did in the 60s and 70s was they said, okay, guess what? We've got there was a huge body of water, a huge lake in western Montana. And it was held in by an ice dam. That ice dam gave way. All of this water gushed out over Idaho and southeastern Washington, down the Columbia Gorge to the Pacific Ocean, and caused all of this amazing erosion and sedimentation that Harlan Bretz was documenting. Never mind that we have to extrapolate up 3 orders of magnitude from modern examples, right? Never mind that the modern examples are utterly minuscule compared to what Bretz was looking at. That has become the dogma to explain these floods. And it's still the entrenched dogma as we speak now. I am trying to demolish it. I want to show that these floods are something much grander than they are. That the source of them was not actually a big glacial lake, but was what Bretz originally theorized, was that there was something that caused this rapid melting of ice. But then his critics said, well, there's nothing that could melt the ice as fast as you're requiring for your floods, so again, your floods didn't happen. But his floods didn't. And they were on inconceivable costs. And this is what I was totally learning to see firsthand. Because I felt like for him to really this information, this insight into the capacity that basically would determine his other civilizations, that he should see this stuff in the field for himself. Because, as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. But going out in the field and experiencing this directly is worth 1,000 pictures. And so he's going to incorporate that into his book. And I would like to say about that book that based upon what I know and what he's shown me a bit of what's going into the book, I'll proclaim without any equivocation that I think it's probably going to be the most important book that's come out in the 21st century, because it's opening a window into a story like no other single source of information, credible information.
Wow, that's a big statement. This whole thing is so mind-blowing, and as mind-blowing as your first appearance. This chart especially is really freaking me out. Like looking at the mortality of all the animals, the mass extinction that must have taken place. One of the things that always bothered me about that idea that human beings killed off the woolly mammoths is that they found these vast fields of uneaten mammoths where there was thousands of them that had died almost instantaneously.
Yeah.
Which is just, that doesn't make any sense. Like, what did they do? They went on a mass killing orgy of slaughter and then just decided not to eat any of them?
Well, the field evidence itself is inconsistent with that. Right here, this is an example. This is one of the many mammoth cemeteries. And what happens is that you can see here that you can see from the shoreline, see that there was a flood. The river rose up to this level, and then when it rose down, it left this in its wake. And what you see here, like this is bone counting at the Berlik Mammoth Cemetery in northern Yakutia, Siberia. Identical deposits are found throughout the Taman Peninsula. And what we see here is these massive bone deposits that have been showing up for the last couple of 100 years. Every time that there's, a thawing or a flood, or these things are washed up on the shore of the Arctic Ocean, what we see is that there were huge herds of woolly mammoths grazing, where now the plant material is only 2 inches high. So clearly, it was a completely different climate there. What's interesting is that you have in Siberia able to support herds of woolly mammoths at the same time that
despite their transgressions against the government,
how is that possible? Just a totally different atmosphere.
I'm still puzzling over that. I have some ideas, but until I can test these ideas a little further.
So without ice core samples, is it possible to figure out what the temperature was in Siberia at that time?
No, they can figure out basically based upon fossil plant.
You will bring down
and you can
the
see that in some
heavens'
cases
wrath.
the tree line was hundreds of miles further north than it is now. And that's clearly, if you've got
They
trees and
are no
forests
longer your people
where
to save.
13 or 14 or 15,000 years ago it was permafrost. You know it was warm, clearly.
So there's still, whoa, What is that? 19th century scene showing ivory floor of the London docks covered by thousands of mammoth tusks from Siberia. This is a drawing, obviously.
Yeah. This
Predates photographs.
Yeah. For hundreds of years, thousands of mammoths, entombed mammoths, and mammoth tusks were being exhumed from the Siberian permafrost. Thousands and thousands and thousands of these. And basically, to me, you look at this is just in-your-face evidence that this was not humans doing this. It was not humans that were slaughtering these mammoths and burying their remains.
Well, it's the instantaneous nature would almost be like people had figured out some new thing, like they figured out some like a doom gun, they and they shot the whole
the doom gun. Well, look at the near extinction of American lives. What brought that about? Trains and high-powered rifles. Right. There was a major technological advance that was able to bring about the near extermination of the American
There's
lives.
actually a guy that I'm going to bring on the podcast soon to discuss that. His name's Dan Flores, who spent a big chunk of his intellectual career studying this. And what he believes is that the bison had a massive population jump that was directly correlating to smallpox epidemic the Native American people. And that when the United States, when we look at the United States history, the big stacks of woolly mammoth skulls, the big stacks of bison skull ears that we look to, like that was a very unusual population of bison that existed because the plains Indians, massive extinction. And then when they had incorporated the horse, like the horse and apparently the American Indians were on their way to extirpating the bison even before we came there. But then they died off in this massive death scenario with the smallpox and all the different diseases that the Europeans had brought over here. And then the mammoth population, the bison population, had grown like almost unnaturally, much larger than it had ever been in the past. And that's when the United States was established, and that's when all the Western European immigrants came along and started turning out all these bisons. It's really a very interesting subject.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. There's flaws. I haven't looked into that. I assume, maybe be wrong with it, but I assume that the bison population had been relatively stable. I am not convinced, though, that there was this massive die-off in the Native American population yet. I'm not convinced. Maybe.
Really?
Well, because I haven't looked into it yet. But one of the things I have seen is that the assumption there is predicated upon that the Europeans arrived and brought the diseases that Native Americans had no defenses for. But the thing is that there's so much evidence now showing that there were lots of explorers and immigrants to the New World prior to the arrival of the Europeans. With the Chinese, the Phoenicians, and I'm not necessarily saying that's credible. None of it's been proven, but there's some interesting data out there that suggests, and there are a number of books written that, again, I haven't accessed it, so I'm not going to take it for granted I'm authority on that. But if some of that turns out to be credible, it would suggest that there was a lot more interaction between the Native American population and other groups around the world, which, if true, to me kind of somewhat undermines this idea that they were, completely susceptible to the introduction of these, to these foreign diseases. But again, I've got an open mind. I'll wait and see. I'd like to see what he says. I'd like to hear his ideas.
For anyone interested, he has a paper in the Journal of American History. It's called Bison Ecology and Bison Diplomacy: The Southern Plains from 1800 to 1850. I just looked for it online. There's a preview that's available, but to download the entire paper or book, I'm not sure which one it is, it's $19.
What journal is it in?
The Journal of American History from September of '91. And like I said, he's working on a new book right now, and I'm trying to get him to come in, but it's very difficult while he's in the middle of
You said September 1991.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can probably.
Dan Flores is his name,
Okay.
and well, just the information that I got about it is pretty mind-blowing.
Okay.
But
sounds interesting. I want to.
Yeah.
Now I want to know more. Thank you for that, Joe.
yeah, please. Now let's go back to that photo that you have on your desktop that you were going to explain to me, but we decided not to talk about it. It's so incredible that you said all this incredible change that we're looking at, the geological structure, all that took place within
This is a satellite from about 500 miles. And what you see here, this is southeastern Washington. And what you're looking at here is part of what's called the Columbia Basalt Plateau. This is part of the terrain that we crossed when I was with Graham. What you see here is that you have an area of, here you can see the between the pixels and the actual squares. That, like you see this red area that's actually this is an infrared photograph. So what happens is the areas that are being cultivated will show up. This whole plateau is covered in this stuff called and it's a type of very fertile soil. It has a rather mysterious and controversial origin. We won't get into that right now, but in some places this loess layer is hundreds of feet thick over a dark basalt bedrock that is the result of these massive outflows of basaltic lava that came out, that extruded between about 6 million and 16 million years ago, right? The hot spot that was the ultimate origin of this basalt is now where Yellowstone, which so you can make that connection. Yellowstone super volcano, yeah. But what you have here is that you have the lighter areas is where this loess topsoil still exists, and the darker areas is where the underlying dark basalt is showing through because the loess was washed away. So what this is
Sentinel battery can be used to provide additional power to your ship.
and basically
Several
that means a
modules remain
branching.
unused. Finding more batteries will enable you to
You can see
utilize
that
the
very
full
clearly
functions of
here,
your command
that the
station.
water came off of this river, which is the Columbia River, flowed over the and washed away the basalt, left these gigantic channels in its wake. And there's more over here to the east, there's more over here to the west. And if we look at actually this, let me go to a different program. Now, what we're looking at is named after the Missoula Great Basin is part of this topicite. As soon as this thing comes up, Canada didn't. Wow. Yeah. Well, and you know, the ice, part of it is, a lot of this Midwest now, a lot of the farming belt of America is basically, growing out of the fertile soil that the ice scraped off of Canada and dumped, down in Minnesota and Iowa and Wisconsin and so someday they may want that back. But we're not going to let them have it.
It's fascinating when you look at that there was this big ice cap, but then the areas around it, no ice. And why was that?
Well, that's one of the mysteries. Again, like over here in Siberia,
Yeah.
You can see over here, this is where all the woolly mammoths were, giant herds of woolly mammoths. And it appears like it may have been warmer than now during the ice, which is very odd.
There's some ice up there? Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, there's some ice up there. Sporadic glaciers, but nothing like what we see in northwestern Europe over here. This was called the Fennoscandian ice sheet. And the ice sheet over North America actually consisted of two ice sheets. The Laurentide, which was centered over Hudson Bay, and the Cordilleran, which was centered over the Canadian Rockies. And in this particular slide, you can see here, this was the Cordilleran over here, over the Canadian Rockies, and this was the Laurentide was much bigger, see? And then there was an area between the two, right here, which has been theorized as, at one point, having been a corridor called the Ice-Free Corridor, and migrants and Paleo-Indian migrants from Siberia would have come across Alaska and down through this corridor here to the lower, and ultimately down here to South America. And it was that groups of bands of Paleo-Indian hunters that, according to the overkill or blitzkrieg hypothesis, wiped out the mega mammoths as they passed by. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so here, this kind of will show the coastlines of the world during the Ice Age, and let me just escape out of this so that we can zoom in a little bit and look at it closer. Okay, so here would be, as we see now,
this is modern coastline.
This is modern coastline. Now I'm going to jump to, this is actually only 300 feet lower than now, and quite a bit different. Let's just look at the United States, North America.
That's amazing. There's a lot more United States.
Yeah, now check this out. Okay, now here's North America as it is now. And you see up here, this is what's called, this is the Bering Strait right here between Alaska and Siberia, right? During the Ice Age, this whole area was
There is a Sentinel power core
exposed
nearby.
because of the
You
lowered
can use
sea
it
level.
to
We'll go
activate the
one
mech
slide
and clear
further,
the path
and we'll
forward.
take a look at what happens up there. Boom.
Wow, so it's all land.
It's all land, and it's connecting North America to Siberia, and that's all drowned.
Wow, I didn't understand that. See, I always thought the Bering Strait was an ice mass. I thought it was during the Ice Age that there was some sort of
Yes.
that it was ice, but it's not. It's land.
No, it's land. And it's not glaciated. And it was home to these extraordinary herds of megamammoths that ranged over these thousands and thousands of square miles. I mean, the drowned area is bigger than modern Alaska.
So how long ago is this?
This is, right at the end, up till the end of the Ice Age. Between like 14, 15,000 years
So
ago.
14, 15,000 years ago, no glaciers in this area. It's all just land, and there's animals living, and people are walking back and forth. Essentially, it was a continent. It was connected. It was all one continent. It was all one.
It was all one continent.
Wow, that's amazing.
And not the coastlines of the world. Look at Florida here. It's double the width of the modern peninsula.
Yeah, it's enormous. And it's so close to Mexico, too. It's almost like a little boat ride.
Now, here is Indonesia, and, there are stories, which I don't know how credible they are, but, there are stories like Lemuria and the Pacific and all of that. Again, I don't know how credible those are. I think the Atlantis story actually has a little more credibility. We talked about that last time somewhat. But here's the model. And you can see the light blue is the coastal shelf area, right? Now, let's go back. We're going to drop sea level 300 feet. And as you can see here, enormous change.
Oh.
So again, enormous areas of land were drowned by the rise of sea levels. Remember this, now when we look at the rise of modern cities, modern civilization, where did they first show up? Where did
On the coasts.
On the coasts, right, at the mouths of rivers, on the coastlines. And during the Ice Age, where would have been the most obvious? Right, habitable real estate, down close to sea level, right? So if there were cities built, if there were thriving communities during the Ice Age, they're now 400 feet underwater.
It's so amazing that all of these stories of floods, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Noah's Ark, that all of these stories seem to really correlate with all this data. I mean, they all seem to coincide.
That's exactly the point.
It's so weird. Okay, most people would think about the story of Noah's Ark, like, oh, it's just some crazy old horseshit. But most likely, they're basing it on something that happened very rapidly in their area.
Yeah. Now, of course, we're most familiar with the story of Noah's Ark. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of stories from all over the world. Manu. The list goes on and on of these culture heroes that somehow had foreknowledge of this impending disaster and were able to take steps to preserve themselves, their family, some diverse cross-section of species. And they all have this, similarity. They all parallel. Now, my way of looking at it is we now know from hard geological records that massive hills, beyond anything that we have even imagined, right, up until a decade or two. They're real. And the other reason, they have stories and myths and legends. Repeatedly, probably the most ubiquitous of all the stories that we've inherited from the past is the story of the world destroying flood. Right? Now, on one hand, we have hard geological records that show there were giant floods. Then we have the epic tales and myths from all over the world about giant floods. Do we now dismiss those floods, those stories out of hand and say, oh, that's just superstitious, pre-literate, pseudoscientific nonsense? I think we'd be making a big mistake. Now, if we accept that those flood stories, that maybe they have been altered with time and people have represent something different. The other elements, the fact that in so many cases there's somebody with out of hand as well. Where does that come from? That there was one group of people, a small group of people, that saw this thing very clearly. Others basically
maybe they were just preppers. Maybe the preppers of 10,000 years ago.
The preppers of 10,000 years ago. I think that. One last slide quick here. Here's Europe. Look at the very top. Now we'll drop sea level. Nobody died. See, that's what I was saying earlier when we started talking. The world of 15,000 years ago is so dramatically different than our modern world that, it's almost difficult to conceive until you start looking at things like this.
And this is all during the so melting of the glaciers just changed everything. And this is while human beings were absolutely alive.
Absolutely. No question. Human beings were alive. So we'll start looking at some of these pictures here. This is from western Montana. It says in Genesis 7:19, the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills were covered. I want you to take a look, as you can see many mountains in the western United States, if you know what you're looking at, that have this on them. You know what those are? Those horizontal lines?
They look like where they're shore.
They're shorelines. Exactly, they're shorelines.
That's absolutely what they are?
That's absolutely what they are. They're shorelines. Reaching right up to the very tops of the hills, you see. And basically what you had was this enormous gush of water filling these mountain valleys almost to the mountain away. And as it drained away, it left the succession of shores etched into the hills. All along the path, this was our first stop. This is Waterloo Falls. This is that basalt I was talking about. Look at this stuff. There's layers of this basalt.
Oh, that's you guys underneath it?
I don't think in this picture. I think I took this picture about 10 years ago. But yeah, I have pictures of me and Graham under there.
Well, dude, you're so tiny. That's so crazy. It's
yeah.
so big.
Right. Now, here's what you've got to picture. You've got this nice gentle valley with a nice river, very pastoral scene, you know, trees and stuff. Probably, you know, mammoths and herds of these animals grazing along the side of this peaceful river with gentle valley slopes. We're talking about perhaps a flood wave, 800,000 coming through. As it comes through, it's ripping up everything in its path. And what it does is it now changes the profile of this valley from this gentle profile to down cutting 800,000, 1,200 feet or more into the bedrock, right? So now, prior to the passage of this giant flood, you had streams and nice little rivers flowing into the main river, which in this case was the Columbia. What happens is after the passage of this flood, it sheared off the side and now, rather than a gentle slope, you've got sheared high. These pre-flood rivers come up and are now water. And that's what we're looking at right here in this picture, if that makes sense to you. And you notice how you've got this undercutting here. That undercutting only occurs when you have enormous, intense turbulence in the water doing this. You see, the water doing this will undercut. See, this modern waterfall here had nothing to do with the creation of this cliff. This cliff was cut, again, probably in a matter of days to weeks by the passage of these giant floods. And there's dozens of these waterfalls that are left. These are called hanging valleys. They can be produced by glaciers, but they can also be produced by enormous, intense floods. This is typical, not typical. This is a bar, a gravel bar, but in this case it's a boulder bar. Now, if you've ever done any walking along a river or a creek or along the beach and you've seen ripples in the sand, and they're typically, you know, if you've got water that's 4 to 2 feet deep, you'll have ripples that are less than 8 feet. What we're looking at here is a flood bar that's 3 miles long. It's up to 250 feet above the model. And the ripples that you can see up to 50 feet. This was produced features like this that are just unequivocal in terms of realizing that this is not hallucination, this really happened.
And this date back to the specific time?
Yes, to this 13,000 years.
So it's
This is evidence.
Has anybody ever tried to debate you on this stuff?
I would certainly welcome debate. I don't claim to have the final word on this, but you know, here's the thing. I've interacted with a lot of geologists that are studying this, professional geologists that are studying this. What I can tell you is that in most cases, the geologists that are studying this, it's basically something they're doing in their spare time. Most of them are engaged, either in the energy industry or working for government for other purposes. What you actually will see here when you begin to look at the trend and the evidence is that I think that the geological community is moving much closer to a scenario like I described. And right now there's actually a controversy because, some of the older guard is wanting to defend this idea of the Yolkin House, this giant lake drainage. There are a group of Canadian geologists who are challenging who goes back to a reinterpretation of a very ubiquitous glacial feature called Drummond. They're very interesting. They look like inverted volcanoes. and it was assumed, and they're always associated with the locations of the glaciers and the ice sheets. So it was therefore assumed that they were somehow created by the glaciers themselves. But glaciers tend to grind things that they're moving over and level things off and scratch them and leave striations and all of this, abrasion. These drumlins are smooth, streamlined features. What Shaw first proposed back in the late 80s was that they had actually been produced by water flowing, massive amounts of water flowing under the glaciers. And there's a very similar. The critic said, well, where did this water come from? And he said, well, I don't know. It must have been enormous subglacial lakes, subglacial reservoirs. The critic said, well, there's no way that a reservoir as huge as your floods would require could have existed under the ice. Therefore, your subglacial floods didn't exist. And that was, to me, the fatal weakness in his theory, was to explain where the water came from. But I think now we can.
And you believe it's an asteroidal impact?
Again, by default, we look at all the cross-section of possible explanations within the realm of nature. We can go through and we can eliminate this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and what we're left with is one that of itself would be fully capable of doing it.
Fully capable, and it makes sense that it happens.
That would make sense that it would happen.
So is there an impact crater that corresponds to this timeline?
Well, that's what I'm working on.
Trying to find it?
Yeah, and I think I've got a pretty good idea, but it's going to take some field research, and next summer I'm planning to do some more field research.
Is there an idea where it hit?
Yeah, I have several ideas.
You don't want to talk about it? Keep it mum?
At this point.
Stealing your scoop?
But when it's time to reveal it,
okay,
let's do it here.
Oh, I would love that. that. Well, you've shown several impact craters. You showed a bunch last time you were here. The one in Australia, that was, I believe you said 5,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And of course, everybody.
Hypothetically, it hasn't been proven yet because again, some of these more recent craters of the last 10,000 years, some of these that have been hypothesized are actually on the bottom of the ocean. The Burkle crater that I think we talked about on the bottom of the Indian Ocean, it's under 2 miles of seawater. So until we can actually get back there and do more in-depth sampling and examination, it'll be impossible to prove it. But I think that the evidence is strongly supportive of that possibility, that maybe 5,000 years ago there was a significant impact into the Indian Ocean that could have caused enormous tsunami waves. Now, I actually posted one of the, somebody, called into question some of the things I had said in the last interview about tsunamis, and that the things I was saying weren't really tsunamis. So I actually wrote an elaborate response to that, which is posted on the Sacred Geometry website, where I've gone into great detail, showing that the evidence really, in the end, I think does support the idea that there had been enormous tsunamis, possibly sweeping that could have been some.
And your timeline, where this mass extinction event occurred, where the massive warming occurred, all of that also coincides with the discovery of this nuclear blast all over Asia and Europe, which is somewhere in the core samples of around the same area, right? Around 12,000 plus.
Yes. You can see here, this is some of the research. You can see this is very typical. The mysterious onset of the universe. Now, this has been kind of the consensus view. Okay, we don't have an explanation. The younger Dryas, that's that interval between those two. Right? You have warming, then the snap back to glacial cold, and the warming. So that interval in between is the younger Dryas. So here they're saying the mysterious onset of the younger Dryas, the 1,300-year-long younger Dryas cold reversal, and you notice the date, 12,900 to 11,600. That means calendar years before the Holocene. So what they've done is they've calibrated this which is not necessarily going to be the same as the actual calendar years. So those dates are very interesting. 11,600 years ago, you may recall from our last interview, is the date given by Plato for the subsidence of Atlantis. 11,000. He said that Atlantis subsided. Anybody can read this if they want to pick up Timaeus, the two dialogues that he describes Atlantis. He gives that date 9,000 years before the exile of the Solar, which took place in 600 BC. So 600 BC and roughly is 2,600 years ago. Add that to the 9,000 years. 600. So now what has happened is 2,500 years ago, Plato gave a date, which would seem to suggest that something immense happened in the Atlantic Ocean. You had an island complex that sank, perhaps from rapid sea level rise. Now, 2,500 years later, here's modern science coming up with the exact date, showing, hey, there was a massive meltdown into the ocean at that date. Now, at this point, nobody within mainstream science is going, oh, well, see, he doesn't mention here, oh, that's the date given by Plato. They don't say it, but it is the case.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's so amazing. Now, Plato, he was told that, right? It was all through stories. Right?
It was handed down. Solon handed it down. Let's see if I can remember this. Through Dropidas to Critias the Elder to Critias the Younger, then Critias the Younger, I guess, to Socrates. Actually, at the forum where Plato would have heard it would have been the Socratic Forum where it was told. So I think there was like 3 generations between Solon and Plato.
The wise men of the time, or the people that were in charge of disseminating knowledge back then, it was such a critical job.
Critical job, yes.
No internet, no books.
And the whole thing was that the whole emphasis was on the oral transmission had to take place without not one iota of change. It had to be transmitted from mouth to ear, unbroken, without change, without alteration.
Which has always been the issue with human beings, hence that telephone game.
Yes.
You know, you tell someone something,
right.
They tell you something. You know,
but if you start out, and you know, it's going to be the same with Native Americans. The Native American storytellers have to go through a very long, arduous term of initiation to show that when they tell the story, it's exactly like they heard it. That's one of the basis of modern Freemasonry, too.
We need to get that with today's modern gossip.
Yeah.
We need to nail that.
But let's just run through a quick succession here of some of the most recent research. Shock synthesized hexagonal diamonds, younger than now, these shock synthesized hexagonal diamonds only occur. There's no natural process that will produce them except for the intense compression of copper.
What year was this started?
Oh, this is probably within the last. It was since 2007. This is probably around 2011.
There was something that was released very recently about micro diamonds.
Last summer.
Yeah, and that also is the same time. So it's just like the evidence keeps accumulating in this time period that something is. The micro diamonds, the nuclear glass, the spikes in the warming that's observable on the ice cores,
all correlate.
The mass extinction events of these animals. This is crazy that you're the guy talking about this event. This is really nuts. And not anything taken away from you, but there's so few people feeding this drum that there's so much information. We're talking about hard data. What you've shown on this show, 3-4 different examples of hard data that points to this event.
Well, here's the thing. Science does consider. So what happens is the guy looking at might not be looking at the guy who's looking at glacial melting. The geologist is not looking at what's going on in the sky. They're not looking at traditions from thousands of years ago. What it does is because of the power of this special pretty short-term is it's easy to miss the big picture. What that does is opens the door for generals, guys who are just, people who are just, guys, men or women, anybody who's curious about this stuff, to look at this and try to see the big picture. Why am I doing this? Well, because for 40 years, I've been obsessed with this stuff. And, I read 2 or 3 scientific articles every single day. And have done so for 40 years plus. So that adds up after a while. And I don't just read and I study. I take notes, 2 or 3 every single year. So you figure, what is that, 1,000 a year? You go back 40 years, that means I probably read something in the order of 40,000 scientific articles from anthropology, geology. I studied geology in college, so, I have some academic background in there. But basically what I have done is tried to piece together the big picture, because early on I saw nobody's doing that. Nobody's doing it, really. And some of the guys that are out there doing it are not doing it with academic rigor. They're bringing in all kinds of weird stuff, which makes it easy for the critics to attack them and dismiss them as being fringe science.
They're throwing some woo into the mix.
They're throwing some woo into the mix, yeah. In fact, one of the Rational Wiki entry on me says something about Randall Carlson and his woo. That's all it says, So I took that as sort of a compliment.